And having said that, I'll hand over to Sarah Parkin, our Minister at Bramall, to just open us in prayer.
Thanks, Richard. Good evening, everyone. It's really wonderful to see so many of you. Some words from the Message translation of Psalm 104. What a wildly wonderful world, God. You made it all, with wisdom at your side. You made earth overflow with your wonderful creations. Let's pray. Amazing God, you spoke creation into being in the place of formless void and darkness, and you saw that it was good. Your marvelous creation takes our breath away with its intricacy and its grandeur, its stunning beauty and its innate practicality, with all its inherent interdependencies. We are awestruck as we pause to reflect on the vast multitude that is your creation, and we praise and thank you. Holy God, you give us the gifts of curiosity and intellect, of wisdom and delight. But too often and for too long, we have disregarded the sacredness of your creation. We have taken it for granted. We have regarded it as being here for our own benefit. In too many ways, we have misused it and abused it, and we are sorry. As we gather together this evening, help us to remember your great goodness and love. Help us to gain fresh insight into what it means to love our neighbour by caring for creation, and help us to understand how we might better pray for and be better stewards of the world which you have made, the world in which we live. Amen.
Thanks very much, Sarah. So we now turn to our main speaker for the evening, or our, well, I won't say quite only speaker, you'll hear a couple of other voices, but our main speaker, Mike Morecroft. Dr. Mike Morecroft is an ecologist who is principal climate scientist for Natural England. And throughout his career, he's specialised in climate change adaptation and mitigation, doing science and applying it to policy and practice. He's coordinating lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, working with a group of international colleagues to produce the chapter on terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems for the 6th report, which is the next one that's going to come out shortly. And he's authored over 150 scientific papers, reports, and book chapters. He's also a lay minister in his local Anglican church and has recently been appointed to a volunteer role as president of the John Ray Initiative, which connects the environment, science and Christianity. So all in all, I can't really think of a better person to start off this series of talks about how we relate to the climate emergency and about how it relates to our faith. So Mike, can I hand over to you?
Great. Well, thank you very much, Richard. And it's really good to be with you tonight. I was just saying, before you all joined us, I was on the phone to my mum just before we started here, and I said, well, I've got to go and speak to a church in Manchester, and it's one of the sort of there's not a lot that's been good about the last year or so, but the way that we can now use technology to to speak across the different parts of the country, but also the world, I think it's something that really is at least a positive sign of something coming out of it. So it's great to be with you. And I'm going to start sharing my screen. So just bear with me a moment. Now, I'm hoping you can see that. Richard, if you could just confirm. Yeah, you're muted, but you're nodding, so that's all good. Right, okay, thank you. Well, climate change, nature and us, and yeah, Richard's explained, I work for Natural England. I'm a scientist by background. I should say that tonight, basically I'm speaking for me. I've put the JRI and the Natural England logo at the start of this presentation, but This is very much my view, so I take full responsibility. Just briefly want to show the starting point for this. I'm an ecologist. I'm interested in how climate change affects the natural world and how that in turn affects us. I'm not really a climate scientist as such, but I've worked on climate science for all my career, really, going back to the late 1980s when I was a research student, a PhD student. And it's worth just briefly, I think, touching on climate itself. And this graph here, and I promise there aren't too many graphs this evening, although there are some, just to warn you. But it shows what the actual rise in temperature has been over the last century and a half. And that's the grey line, which you can see wiggles about a little bit, but basically goes up. It shows what it would have been like if there were no factors except for greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and human factors. That's the red line. And then the blue line is what would have happened to climate if people hadn't been around, we hadn't been putting fossil fuels into the atmosphere and so on. And you can see really, although the little wiggles are, if you like, the natural bit, the overall rise in actual temperature maps very closely onto what we would expect as a result of human activity. And really over time, I've watched the evidence get stronger and stronger that the climate is changing, that it's already changed, and that actually it's almost entirely the result of human activities. So that's the context. But what does that mean? Well, it means we're seeing a number of things. Warmer temperatures, that's the one that's really quite clear. But we're also starting to see evidence of changes in other aspects of the climate. So in the UK, there's a tendency to have drier summers and wetter winters. Now, I know we do sometimes get a wet summer. We all remember it, don't we? But on average, we're starting to see a trend that way. And all of the computer models suggest that's going to be more common. We're also seeing heavier rainfall. When it rains heavier. And that obviously creates a lot of problems for floods, potentially, when the water runs off the land that much quicker during a heavy rainstorm than in a less heavy one. So we're also seeing an increased risk of floods, but also drought in dry summers and wildfires. And this is true of the UK, but it's also true in a number of other parts of the world. We're also seeing the sea level rise, and that's leading to issues of increasing coastal erosion. And we're seeing the salt water start to sort of soak into the land, what's called saline intrusion. And there are parts of the coast you can go, places in East Anglia, for example, where you can actually see where the coast has moved by an appreciable amount. But there are also some less direct effects of climate change. So new pests and diseases, for example, tree diseases, crop diseases of crops, agricultural pests, things that couldn't survive in our part of the world now can. And then there's even more indirect effects, changes in world markets as, for example, an agricultural crop which was produced perhaps in the Mediterranean may be able to be produced further north as we go along. Things like sunflowers, for example, you start to see in Britain. And then, of course, the effects of changing policy, more renewable energy, that has its effects as well. And underlying all of this, increasing uncertainty. And not so many years ago, you'd often find people arguing, well, it's also uncertain, we can't do anything about it. We don't hear that argument so much these days, but it wasn't a particularly good one, because actually uncertainty just makes it that much harder to get along and do what you want to do if you're working with the land, doing nature conservation like I do, or anything else. Uncertainty is not our friend. If you don't know what, well, you think of it in human terms, if you're buying a house, uncertainty in house prices isn't a good thing. If you think of it in terms of employment, if you're not certain whether you've got a job or not, that's not a good thing, is it? You know, you might have one, yes, but you might not. And so uncertainty is something we actually have to adapt to. It's a problem in its own right that we have to live with and try and minimize best we can. And my specialist area of work is around ecosystems, nature, species. And there have been some very high profile examples worldwide of species and ecosystems that are vulnerable to climate change. The polar bear is a bit of a picture postcard, or picture, poster boy of climate threat. Clearly a species that depends on a cold environment and sea ice, which is becoming less common. But there's also the corals, and you can see the picture here of coral that's being bleached and turning white because they don't cope well with high temperatures. And somewhere like the Great Barrier Reef off Australia, there's increasing damage that we're seeing. If we look at the more indirect effects, we can see the effects of wildfire. And there's a picture there from California. A couple of years ago, I was in California. I should say I try and minimize my flying, but I was there on a family holiday as our kids have got older. Tried to see the world at least sometimes, and actually felt ash falling on us from wildfire, blown hundreds of miles. And it's quite a sobering thought. You can see these impacts happening. And then the picture at the bottom is of the Amazon, and it's a satellite photo, but you can see that there's some little grey wisps of smoke you can see from fires there. And one of the things that we'll come on to a bit more as we go along is that actually the fact that natural systems like the large forest of the Amazon have been damaged and degraded by people, and in this case you can see where it's been cleared. You can see a kind of sort of network of open areas which are alongside roads. That degradation, that breaking up of the forest has actually made fire more likely, and in turn climate change has made it potentially more serious when it does happen. So there's a combination of different factors there exacerbating the problem. And if you look overall at the different key areas of vulnerability across the world, you can see that many natural systems are potentially in trouble. And this is quite a complicated graphic from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change back in 2017, a report that came out. But it shows a number of different systems. So you've got the warm water corals, the coral reefs on the left-hand side, for example. And then going upwards, you can see different levels of temperature. And the higher you go, the more the temperature. And the colour shows how serious the impacts are. So there's a sort of grey band which shows about where we are now with temperature, about a degree warmer than it was historically. And you can see basically if where that grey band intersects, it's red or purple, then we're in trouble already. And that's the case with the warm water corals. If it's white, it's still all right, like the mangroves. But if you go across further, you'll see there's quite a lot of yellows, which mean we're just starting to see the effects on things like some of the fisheries, and the Arctic is warming up. That's looking problematic, and there's a whole range of other things. Don't worry about the detail. It's just to show, though, that there are systematic impacts across the natural world and people's reliance on it that are starting to show up now. And that same report also showed that even a 0.5 degree matters. So if we have 1.5 degrees of warming, which is what we're trying to hold global warming to, then we'll get a certain level of loss of, for example, species that this shows here. For example, 50%, 6% of insects losing more than 50% of their current range. But if you go up to 2 degrees of warming, it goes up to 18%. So even half a degree matters. We will lose more the greater the rate of climate change. So that's the kind of big picture global perspective. What about in the UK? And a few years ago, I led the writing of this little summary report on climate change impacts, working with 40 or so scientists across different organisations. And we came up with strong evidence that climate change is affecting UK biodiversity. So we can see that species are tending to occur further north than they would have done. We're seeing things happening earlier in the spring. We're seeing the combination of species, the communities starting to change. We're seeing interactions with some other pressures, things like the fragmentation of habitats and drainage of them, and also more of those extreme events like droughts and heat waves. And colleagues did some similar work in the sea and also showed a range of different effects. I won't go through the detail of this, but there's similar effects on species. But interestingly, in the sea, you're also seeing effects on, for example, oxygen levels. As the temperature rises, the oxygen level declines, which is a problem. But just to put some pictures to this, I've said species are moving northwards, and for some that's good. Some can colonize new areas. So, for example, the peacock butterfly there and the small red-eyed damselfly are both species that can colonize new areas. They weren't common or even present in some parts of the north of England and certainly into Scotland, and now they are. On the other hand, bottom right, there's a little butterfly, the mountain ringlet, which is only found in the coldest parts on the fells in Cumbria and in the Scottish mountains. And there's evidence that that's actually starting to die off and colonies are disappearing. So there are some winners, but there's also losers. Those species adapted to the cold places are starting to disappear. I sometimes think the mountain ringlet is, if you like, Britain's version of the polar bear. It's not quite as spectacular, but it's a nice little species. It'd be a shame to lose. And we can see that it goes beyond individual species. So some work I was involved with a colleague from University of Reading showed a declining trend in cold adapted bird species compared to those that were better adapted to warm conditions, as you might expect. Even in the sea, you can see things are changing. So amongst the plankton, different species, some are doing well, some are doing badly. And it's those that are adapted to warm weather that are doing well, those adapted to cold weather or cold water anyway, are tending to decline. And that's what this graph shows. And of course, it isn't just about temperature. This is a slide I quite like to show to illustrate what's happening with sea level rise. This is at Salthouse on the Norfolk coast, and this is the car park, except it isn't anymore because the shingle ridge, which used to be, if you like, to the left of this picture as you look, has moved inland by some tens of meters. It was accelerated greatly in a winter storm during that winter, but that formed part of a pattern that's been going on for a lot longer. And okay, it's not the end of the world perhaps if you lose a car park and you have to move it further back, but it's also you can just see here the remains of some small saltwater lagoons, which are saltwater areas just back in from the coast that have a very distinct set of species associated with them. And obviously that's been squeezed by this. And you can see a whole sort of rolling back of the coast happening. And we can summarize that more generally, the places that are most at risk. We can see that the species of cold places, what we call montane, the mountain systems like the Alpine Ladies Mantle up there, they're at threat. Some of the wetlands because of potential for drought, and also the coastal habitats. And we've recently done an assessment on our national nature reserves that Natural England manages at those what we call biodiversity features that they're there to protect. So it could be species, could be habitats, but it's aspects of biodiversity, things that we want to conserve, aspects of nature we want to conserve. And we looked to see how many of them were at threat from climate change in all its different elements. And you can see here we characterize them as coastal or freshwater, grassland, heathland, wetland, woodland, or upland sites. And it's a sort of traffic light system. It shows us the proportion of those aspects of nature that are at high risk, they're the red ones. Those that are intermediate risk, the amber ones, and then the green ones are okay. And you can see actually, in most cases, there is a threat. More of these features of nature are either at high or intermediate threat than those that we think are at low risk. So I suppose I started off my career thinking about what the impacts of climate change were. I was quite involved in setting up some big monitoring and experiment studies to try and work out what the impacts were. But as I've gone on, the question that seems to me the most important one is, well, what can we do about it? We can see the problem, we know that, but what do we do? And those of us who work in the field think about responding to climate change in two ways. One is what we call mitigation, and that's all about tackling the causes of climate change. So reducing greenhouse gas emissions, or where we can, for example, by growing trees, taking carbon out of the atmosphere, sequestering carbon, to use the technical term. And that's clearly critical. But we also have to adapt to the change that we are already seeing, and that which we can't stop. Because even if we could turn off the tap, if you like, and stop greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere today, there's still change that's going to happen. The system has a certain amount of inertia and temperature will go on rising. So we need to deal with the effects. We need to reduce vulnerability as best we can of people, but also of nature. And we need to adjust to changes that we simply can't stop. So how do we do that from the perspective of me as an ecologist in terms of the natural environment? Well, I sort of hinted at it a bit earlier. We're more at risk, our habitats and our species are more at risk because they're in a poor condition in a country like ours. High human population, they've been exploited for millennia, and that's taken a toll. So a lot of our patches of habitat are quite small, they're quite broken up, and often in poor condition. So we want to make them bigger, more joined up, and in better condition. And you can see if you look at the sort of classic patchwork of the English landscape, there's scope there to just sort of fill in some of the gaps and have a bit more nature in there. Although it's worth saying, of course, we still want to be able to grow food, so we can't take the most productive bits. There's quite a lot of bits of agricultural land that are not terribly productive. But we could probably do that. We can also restore what are called ecosystem processes. So one of the best examples is some of the wetland areas, marshes, bogs. They need a certain level of water to work the way they should work. And we need to restore those processes. They've often been drained or damaged by the surrounding land use. And then there are some specific climate change threats that we can reduce, and I'll show an example of that in a minute. And also reduce some of the other pressures that we can deal with, things like air pollution or some of the damage from development. Just wanted to show an example of where you can actually directly affect climate change. This is one of our national nature reserves in Norfolk, Calthorpe Broad, which is at risk from the intrusion of salt water. But we can pump water into there to keep the water level up during a dry summer. And there's a rather elegant solution with a little wind-powered pump that can pump water in to keep the water level up, which I think it's quite a nice green solution to an environmental problem. There's also been increasing evidence, and this is some of the research that we've been involved with and supported, to show that if you look at the country as a whole and the landscape as a whole, some places are warming more than others. And if you think about it, there's also some places that are just naturally a bit warmer. Lower lying land is warmer than high lying land. South facing slopes are warmer than the north facing ones. And we can take advantage of that to identify what we call refugia, places where things can survive even in a warmer climate. And then there's a certain amount we can do to manage change. So one of the pictures on the right-hand side here is of a very soft eroding cliff on Brownsea Island in Poole Harbour, and that was initially protected by some concrete sea defences, what are called gabions, which are actually a sort of steel cage containing boulders that holds the line of the sea. And it seems a good idea in principle, but actually what you end up with is you just end up with this sort of artificial coastline and none of the coastal habitats. No sand, no salt marsh or anything like that. So actually removing it and allowing the coast to change naturally, as long as people don't live there and you're not threatening them, then that has some advantages. We also need to be more flexible. So very often things like cutting hay was always done at a particular time of year, but actually the hay crop may be ready a few weeks earlier in a warmer spring, and it may dry out in the summer. So you need to change when you do things. And we also need to think about where we find species as they're moving northwards. We might need to protect them where they are now rather than where they used to be. And in some ways, it's a sort of bureaucratic process to make sure you've got the right objectives for the right nature reserve. But if you don't do that, then it makes it quite hard to do a management plan, for example, for the site. We're also starting to think about what really is native now. What's a natural species for this country? And how do we feel about species that have been thriving in other parts of the world starting to emerge here? And if it's some of the sort of French butterfly species, well, what's not to like? But what about if it's a pest species? So it's a balancing act, but we're starting to think more seriously about changing our views about what's a native species for this part of the world. And we're also helping species to move around a bit more by joining up the landscape. And the little butterfly at the bottom here, the silver-spotted skipper, is one that can do well in a warmer climate, but it doesn't disperse very easily. Doesn't fly very far. So you've got to kind of join up the patches to help it to spread. And we're even thinking about whether we should be moving species around if they can't get there by themselves under their own steam, as it were. And this I always quite like this photo. This is with colleagues from Scotland and Wales in Scotland, looking for the species that you can see ringed on the right here, which is a particular sort of lichen. It's very small and it doesn't look any different to any of the other ones around it, although I probably shouldn't say that. But it's if you know what you're looking, you can find it. And this is interesting because it's a trial, and it's obviously a species that's not that's quite easy to work with. It's quite small. It's not going to interfere with anything else if you start moving it around. But our colleagues in Scotland and their conservation agency, Nature Scot, been working with scientists to try it, to see if we move it somewhere else where it wasn't, where we think the climate will be suitable. And we did make that work. And we'd be interested to see what results they find. I'm just going to pull back a bit from, I suppose, my day-to-day work as a conservation agency to look at the big picture. So globally, the world's come together to agree targets for reducing the rise in global temperature and all that brings with it. And the Paris Agreement is a key moment there back in 2015. And the world agreed to try and hold the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels and pursue efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees. I've put the exact framing of that up there. It's a balance between what we'd really like, which is really no more than 1.5 degrees, which we're already getting dangerously close to, and also recognizing that's extremely difficult, and it may get a bit higher than that. But those who look at these things at a global level have been totting up what the different policies add up to in terms of climate change. So this is sort of schematic thermometer showing global temperature. And if you see there's an arrow, see if you can see my cursor, there we go, just there. You are here, we are here, which is 1.2 degrees of warming above the pre-industrial average, so what it was before the Industrial Revolution and widespread carbon emissions. So that's where we are. And the Paris Agreement goal is just up here, that line that goes across there. So we haven't got far to go. And the world's been making various commitments. And at the moment, current policies are around about here, about suggesting it would take us to 2.9 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial average, far higher than we want to be. Various pledges have been made, and if they're all honoured, that would take us to about 2.4 degrees, or maybe about 2 degrees on a good day. But clearly shows, as a global community, as a human race, we've got some work to do. But the good news, I suppose, or well, good news, that's probably a bit strong, but at least a hopeful angle on this is that actually, if you look at the global carbon cycle, the way carbon, the CO2 in the atmosphere, interacts with the other parts of the Earth, the land and the sea, you can see there's lots of different arrows going all over the place here. Things putting carbon into the atmosphere, and things taking it out, and there's scope to modify that. So you can see I've ringed 4 of the big fluxes, as they're called. So from left to right, 9.5 gigatons of carbon, which is an impossibly large amount to imagine. But anyway, 9.5 gigatons of carbon, the largest single amount here, is coming from burning fossil fuels. And that clearly needs to be reduced. But another 1.5 degrees is actually coming from changes in land use globally, including deforestation, loss of forests. So that's another one to try and stop. But on the plus side, 3.2 gigatons of carbon are coming out of the atmosphere, taken up by plants. That's 3.2 land plants, 3.2 gigatons. So something like a third of the emissions of greenhouse gases from fossil fuels are taken up by living things on the land. And a further 2.5 gigatons over here go into the sea. So there is hope that if we manage the land better and the sea better, we can reduce emissions, but we can also increase the uptake of carbon from the atmosphere. It won't solve the whole problem, but it's part of the solution. So in a country like Britain, we need to restore our natural environment where we can. And one of the best examples of this is peat. And I'll say a bit more as we go along, but particularly across the northern parts of Britain, we have substantial deposits of peat. The peat is sort of half decomposed plant material that builds up in waterlogged conditions. In waterlogged conditions, plants don't totally break down, and the carbon they've taken out of the atmosphere is stored as peat, and it builds up and up and up, and it can get to great depth. many meters depth over literally millennia. But we've used it in different ways. At the most extreme is a place like this, Bolton Fell Moss in Cumbria, where it was used for horticultural peat for gardens. And you can see the picture on the top left. Layers of peat were stripped away to provide horticultural peat. But that's stopped now, and the water level's been raised, and efforts have been made to restore it. And you can see down there that nature can restore itself given half a chance. And you can see that the sphagnum moss that creates a lot of the peat, some of the sedges are starting to come back in. So restoration is possible, and that's good not only for nature but also for carbon. So when you've got lots of bare peat, you're losing carbon to the atmosphere. It's oxidized, turns into carbon dioxide. When you've got the green covering, you first stop the emissions, then you gradually start to take up carbon again. And there's a number of things like that we can do, not just peatland restoration, but also woodland creation. Much of Britain would have been forest. We deforested it long, long ago, at least our ancestors did. And there's now a big push to create more forests. Trees are great at growing and taking up carbon to grow. And one of the few things which really can take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere at scale is a young, healthy, fast-growing woodland. It's not just trees and peat. It's also what happens on the coast. Salt marsh is another really big store of carbon, which can trap carbon from the atmosphere. There's also increasing evidence that some of the other marine habitats, including seagrass, can play a role as well. And all of these have had a history of exploitation and damage over the years. So we need to fix them if we're going to get benefit from them for this. There's also scope within the farmed environment as well. And I've been on farms like the one in the top left picture here in East Anglia, where they're trying to manage the soil better. A lot of carbon's lost from soil, particularly in places that actually are peat underneath, but have been turned into agricultural land, like this farm here. And they're trying to raise the water level, manage the peat and the soil better. But there's also potential for bioenergy, growing fuel crops rather than using fossil fuels, and reducing emissions from livestock. Cattle particularly are a big source of methane, which is a very powerful greenhouse gas and significant contributor to global warming. So reducing the amount of livestock and trying to manage down the emissions from them is important. Of course, there's implications there for our diet. If we eat less meat on average, I'm not saying become a vegetarian necessarily, but if on average we ate less meat, it would be healthier for us and would also help to cut carbon emissions. And it's not really my field, but there's also scope to reduce emissions from, for example, machinery on farms. But if we restore nature, there's also increasing evidence we can help to make ourselves safer from the effects of climate change, those we can't stop. So a nice green park on a hot summer's day, you've only got to think about walking into a city park, perhaps with some trees and some green space. It feels cooler than it does on the surrounding streets. And if you go and measure, it is a significant difference. It is a degree or two cooler in those green spaces within cities. So greening our cities is part of the solution. And we can also do more to minimize the flood risks from heavier rainfall and rising sea levels. By renaturalizing watercourses, a lot of our streams have been straightened over the years to take water off the land quickly, which is good for draining the land sometimes, but it's not great if you're the person on the receiving end downstream. And actually, we need to try and keep water in the places where it can do no harm, or maybe even do some good, rather than flooding into our homes. So repairing some of those watercourses to hold water back has benefits. And similarly at the coast, I mentioned process of managerial alignment on a small scale for nature, but at a large scale, it also creates a buffer to create new coastal habitats that can protect people and agricultural land from the force of the sea during a storm event. I'm coming towards the end of the talk, but I thought it was just important before we go much further, just to recognise that if we look at the emissions of greenhouse gases across the UK from different sectors, there are some really very big ones that come out in, if you look on this graph here, the transport sector and the energy supply sector from burning fossil fuels, also business and residential use. Agriculture comes out somewhere in the middle, and this slightly mysterious one on the far right-hand side of land use, change and forestry is also a small net emitter. And this one here is interesting because it includes forestry, which actually takes carbon out of the atmosphere, which is below the line. It's a good thing. But it also includes the loss of carbon from peatlands, which takes it above the line into the problem sphere. So nature-based solutions, as they're sometimes called, are part of the answer, but is really every sector of society and the economy needs to be on board. So what do we do in practical terms? And I'm a scientist, yes, but actually, as I've gone on, I've realised more and more that science by itself is not enough. You actually have to help people to adapt. So a lot of my work these days is actually doing just that. So producing reports, for example, that give practical advice and useful information, but also actually talking to people. I spend quite a lot of time when I'm allowed out anyway, without COVID restrictions, going and talking to some of our site managers about the effects of climate change and what we can do about it. And we are starting to see more action. We need more, but we can see that peatlands are being restored, often by blocking drainage channels, which is what's going on here to try and reverse the effects of drainage. Although I showed you a picture of a site that had been cut for peat, actually drainage of the uplands, the fells, has been a bigger problem in terms of the area affected. It was done to increase agricultural productivity, but wasn't particularly successful in that, and we're now trying to undo that effects of drainage from the past. And of course, there's tree planting going on. If you get tree planting right, it can not just benefit carbon, but also can provide a shading effect. We talked about that in the city, but also shading a watercourse like down at the bottom here, allowing the stream to stay cooler. And one of the interesting things as well is actually you don't always even need to plant trees. If you can just let nature take its course, and in many cases trees will grow back naturally because it's what the land would have naturally been covered by. And the picture on the top right there is Craigmiggy in Scotland, where just that's been happening, where they've protected that area from browsing by deer. And I suppose I've stuck fairly firmly within my professional sphere up to this point, and I'll reflect on from a bit more of a Christian perspective in a little while. But I thought it was also worth saying, well, what can we do as churches? And we don't own vast amounts of land, most of us as individual churches. So as an Anglican, I have to say the church commissioners nationally are not trivial landholders, but that's probably for another day. But what about us as local churches very often? Well, I've talked for many years in my church about being better, I suppose, at environmental stewardship, but we've really started to get the bit between our teeth recently. So top left is our churchyard in summer, where we've created a wildflower meadow in part of it. Need to be done sensitively. It's taking people with you and not necessarily letting everything overgrow, but it's been generally given a very warm welcome in the way we've done it. We've also, on the right-hand side, been involved with some local tree planting initiatives, working with the local secular environmental group, which some of our members are also members of. And I think there's great potential there for the church to raise awareness and, you know, to play a part in changing the culture, I guess, and making this more mainstream. And I do commend to you, if you haven't come across it already, the Eco Church project run by the Arosha charity, which certainly we've used and a number of others have to really challenge ourselves. My little picture at the bottom right is of a school strike in America, nothing to do with the UK churches, but I think it's also obviously important to say that we do need political change. And talking as a public servant, that's a little uncomfortable sometimes in my professional life, but there's no getting away from the fact if there isn't a groundswell for change, then things stay the same. Politicians are human, they respond to what other humans want. And there's a role for at least some churches and Christians in that. And that's one thing actually I can't do as a public servant scientist, is really be a campaigner. You know, sometimes as a scientist, you have to be dispassionate. You have to be the one who's the cold fish and tells people the boring but true stuff. But you don't have to be like that. And we need the campaigners and the enthusiasts as well. So just to wrap up this section then, so some conclusions. Climate change is here and now. The risks will increase though in future. We know that species, habitats, ecosystems are vulnerable to climate change, but we can do something to reduce vulnerability, particularly restoring them where they've been damaged. Some change is inevitable and we need to prepare and adapt to that. Restoring nature can help to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and also help people to adapt to climate change and make ourselves and our children's lives safer. But there's no getting away from the fact that we still need to eliminate fossil fuels. And also, it's not just for people like me, everyone needs to play their part. And I think I will stop at that point, Richard, and we can take some questions. And you are muted, Richard.
I've just spotted, yeah. Okay, so thank you very much. I can't imagine a better start introduction to this series than the one you've just given. So thank you very much. We have got a few questions coming in chat. I'll try and take the ones I think are more relevant to Mike specifically. There are some quite general questions there, but there's a couple that I think are more specific about Mike's role. So first of all, Bernadette asks, what role does Natural England have in protecting habitats from development, from things like housing, transport? Do you have any role in protecting existing habitats?
We have some. I mean, our powers are sort of defined by legislation. So we're what's called a statutory consultee. So if it's something that affects a protected site or a protected species, then local authorities have to have to ask for our advice before they give planning permission. They don't have to take it. We're only an advisor. If a developer should damage a protected species, then we can bring a prosecution. Has to be said, we don't very often do that, but we can. And what we can certainly do is provide advice. And I think going forward, there will be a new approach, which is called the Nature Recovery Network and local nature recovery strategies. So just yesterday, the Environment Bill was sort of put back on the agenda in Parliament. And that will give us more opportunity, I think, to identify where are the important places which will need protection. But I'm afraid we can't stop all the things we'd like to be perfectly honest. And actually, it's usually local authorities who are in the lead on planning permission.
And a kind of follow-on one there about the role of Natural England. Has it got any specific role in relation to the COP26 meeting?
Not as part, well, not I say not formally, that's probably an exaggeration. It's not, I mean, yes, we have people, we're giving advice to government on it. And one of my colleagues has been seconded into DEFRA, the government department for the environment, to support that specifically. So our role really is as an advisor, science-based advisor to support the government, and help them to do the right thing, I suppose, in negotiations. Because one of the key things, of course, is being the host. We need to set a good example, and we like to think we can help with that.
Excellent. Yeah. Perhaps one final question on a slightly different subject, but I think of interest to all of us. Mark asks, have you been able to see any changes from the reduced lifestyles we've been having over the last year yet? Has there been any effects on that you can see on what's going on as a result of the pandemic, basically?
I mean, globally, there has been there was a slowdown in the rise of CO2, although that I think that is quite reversible. I think that started to change. It's not a very deep-seated change, I don't think. I think one of the most interesting things in the UK is how much more people have been outside in many places. There's not much else you can do, and people going for a walk and rediscovering the joys of nature. And I think that's not a bad starting point for actually, appreciating the environment and some of its problems. So I hope that will be a step in the right direction. And of course, there's less commuting at the moment and that sort of thing. I think the jury's really out though on how long lasting these will be. I think there's a challenge for us all to, not just to put everything back as it was, but take some of the positives and do things better. And including using Zoom, of course. So you don't need to have people driving around the country to talk to you.
Think of how much petrol we've saved from a meeting like this evening. Okay. I'm going to move on because I've asked each of the speakers to talk about the science for the majority of the evening, but then spend a shorter time just reflecting on how their scientific experience sort of reflects on their faith. So I'll give Mike another 10 minutes just to talk about that angle of what he does and who he is.
Yeah, great, thank you. I'm also, if you'll excuse me, I'm just going to put my light on. It might just need me, you don't really need me with a halo, so that would be a little pretentious, wouldn't it? But hopefully that's okay. Yes, so when we first talked about this, Richard said to me, to reflect a bit on prayer and praying for our planet. That's the title, isn't it, of the whole series. And I must confess, my first reaction, I'm not sure I'll put it quite like this, was, why me? I do, from time to time, fairly regularly, get asked to talk about the theology or the ethics of looking after the natural environment, better environmental stewardship. But I'm not often asked to talk about prayer, and I don't think I'm an expert in it. I'm not even sure I'm very good at it, if I'm honest. So I ummed about this, and I thought, well, actually, probably, who is an expert? What's an expert in prayer? Actually, shouldn't we talk a bit more about our spiritual lives and, not just in terms of what we believe, but actually our spiritual life, our relationship with God, and a bit of honesty about that would be a good thing, wouldn't it? So I'm not going to pretend to you that I'm an expert on prayer. But I will say prayer is an integral part of my life. My faith is important to me. It's sort of interwoven all through it. I do pray morning and evening, and at times in the day. not for as long as I should or I would like to. But, I'm busy. My career's got incredibly busy over the last year or two with increasing interest in climate change. But, I've got teenage children. I've got an aging mother. They all take time. It's very easy, I think, for your prayer life to get squeezed out. So I think the discipline of praying morning and evening, or whenever works for you, I think it's important. And I would also say I do try and make sure that most Sundays I am in church, and I think that sort of weekly rhythm of worship and taking time out from daily life, however important my job is, and I like to think it does matter, but you still need to disengage, to focus on God, your family, your friends, your local community, and prayer is an important part of that. As I was reflecting more, I thought it's also, I think our spiritual life is quite closely bound up with our relationship with the natural world, or at least it is for me. Sometimes it helps me directly to pray, to go into nature, into a natural space, moved by the beauty of the landscape or of particular plants or animals. Just the wonder of it all. It's good to wonder. When we're children, we're much better at it than when we're adults if we're not careful. We should try not to lose that sense of wonder, I think. And that can be the start of prayer. But I think also there's increasing evidence, and some of my colleagues have worked on this, that the natural environment is good for our mental health. And actually, if you are outdoors more, accepting not everyone can if you're not healthy, for example. But if you can get out, it is good for you. Calms you, takes away some of the stress. And good though Zoom is, it's not good to be on a screen the whole time. And I think if we are going to get better at looking after the natural world, we need to be a bit more in touch with it, really. And you can't do that in quite the same way through a screen as you can, in your garden or walking around the local park or hiking up a mountain or whatever it is. And I think that better mental health can help us with our prayer life. We can hear God better with a quiet mind. And I also think if we turn our attention to God, that can help quieten our mind as well. So there's a kind of a synergy for me between our mental health, the environment around us, and our relationship with God. I think prayer for me is primarily about making time for God. I mean, he's always there, isn't he? But time to listen or simply be aware of him. And, to ask him, the idea of intercession, to asking for what's on our hearts. And I was musing on this, obviously it is right to pray for a restoration of nature, for successful tackling of climate change. If we care about it, we should pray about it. Does that mean he's going to wave a magic wand? Well, no, I don't think so. In the context of climate change, we're praying for a better world, but of course Jesus says, we're praying that your will be done. God's will be done in the Lord's Prayer. And I think it's also about aligning ourselves with the will of God, and we can be, at least in a small way, part of the answer to that prayer. And yes, we need the power of God behind us. I do believe God does act in the world, but he created natural laws and processes for a reason, and I don't think there's a shortcut there. We have to be prepared to be changed by him, and building up our spiritual life it's not an abstraction from the world. It's actually it's being prepared better to live in the world and to do his will. And I think, Richard, that's as much as I've got to say really on prayer and praying for our planet. But I think it's really good to come together to think about these things and to, you know, to bring together the spiritual, the theological, the scientific, and you know, that's part of being fully human, is to do all of those things, and also, you know, our relationships with other people as well. So, okay.
That's fantastic, Mike. Thanks very much for those reflections. They certainly resonate quite strongly with me, and it'd be interesting to see as we go into breakout groups how the rest of the audience respond to that. Which is what we're going to do now. We're going to give Mike a rest. We're going to go into breakout rooms. You're all consenting adults, so you can talk about whatever you choose to talk about. But I would suggest that you spend a little bit of time just introducing yourself. You almost certainly won't know the other people in the group. That you perhaps think first a little bit about whether there's anything in the first talk about the science that particularly struck you. And then maybe move on to the question of whether there's anything that you'd like to say in your groups about how we can pray for our planet, perhaps triggered by some of the things that Mike talked about there. And the other thing I'd say is we have got a little bit of time later on. If there's anything further you'd like to ask Mike, there'll be another 10 minutes at the end. I don't think you can put things into the chat from the breakout room, but when you get back from the breakout room, if there's any questions you'd like to pose to Mike in the final 10 minutes, please get them onto chat fairly quickly after you come back. I've asked Matt to divide us into rooms that should give us about 5 or 6 people in each breakout room. So I'll let him do that now, and you'll have 15 minutes to just spend some time together and reflect on what you've heard this evening.
Got about 10 seconds until the rest of the rooms get kicked out.
Okay. So if any of you that have come back have got any questions you'd like to just finish up with for Mike, please do put them in the chat and we'll.
Everyone's back now.
Everyone's back. Okay. Great. Well, I hope you've all had a chance to meet some new people, and you've all had a little bit of chance to reflect on what Mike's been talking about. If you've got any further questions you'd like for Mike, do put them in the chat. But I've held one back, which I thought was more appropriate to have after the talk than beforehand. Was one from Vic Crane, who said this is quite an overwhelming situation. Mike, there are so many good projects you've described here, but do you have any specific prayer requests?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I saw that one. Yeah, I did have a quick read of the questions we weren't able to answer, but or didn't have time to answer anyway. Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think at the sort of big scale, I think particularly with this COP26 meeting coming up in the autumn and all the run up to it, I think it'd be really good to pray that our political leaders and those of the rest of the world don't just make big commitments, but they put in place a proper plan to actually deliver those commitments. Because it's very easy just to say you'll do something, to make a promise without really having an idea of how you're going to keep it. So I would pray that we move into that space where we're really planning to do things. I mean, personally, for me, there's so much more interest around climate change this year and last year, and there's any number of things I could do. And I think it's actually about, if you could pray for what I'd see the right priorities, actually, where I can make most difference. And yeah, those are two very specific things. Yeah, if that's the kind of thing you're thinking.
Anybody else got anything that perhaps anything that came up particularly in a group that they like to report back? Very practical question from Sue to say, has the talk been recorded? So yes, the talk has been recorded. We'll be doing something over the next week to get them onto the website. So do keep a look onto that. If you go to the program page and then through the individual speakers, I'll put the recording on the individual speakers page. So the talks have been recorded and they will be made publicly available. And I think it'll be roundabout within the week to get that turnaround. So that's good. Well, I'll thank Mike for spending his evening with us this evening. So thanks very much for an excellent start to this series. I'm going to hand over now to Andrew Pratt, who's our hymn writer in residence, to just say a few words of closing prayer, and then I'll finish off with just a little plug for next week's session. So over to you, Andrew. I think
Andrew currently has his camera off.
And I'm muted. How's that?
Oh, there you go.
That better?
Yeah. Yes, that's fine.
Okay. And I need to share a screen. Let me do that. And I need to share another bit of screen. This evening, we had some words from Sarah, and they were from the message. And from a psalm, and I've made note of it here, 104. I've gone to Psalm 19 because it seems pertinent to what we've been listening to this evening. And I thank Michael so much for all that he's said and shared and the stimulating way in which it's been presented to us. Psalms speak in so many different ways. They can speak of joy and they can speak of celebration. They can also offer lament, and occasionally they try to give guidance. And I'm looking at verses 7 to 9 of Psalm 19, as the message has them. The revelation of God is whole and pulls our lives together. The signposts of God are clear and point out the right road. The life maps of God are right, showing the way to joy. The directions of God are plain and easy on the eyes. God's reputation is 24-karat gold with a lifetime guarantee. The decisions of God are accurate, down to the nth degree. Sounds fine, sounds rosy in a way, but I sense that for a lot of us, and when it comes to trying to manage the earth, trying to live together, trying to cope with climate change and all of the issues that are there for Michael day by day, and us in a sense equally, but in a different way, things are not nearly as clear as this psalmist makes them out to be. And so a prayer in the form of a hymn. And hopefully you can see that on your screens now. Let us pray. Called to be partners with God in creation, stewards of the biosphere, what can we do? How can we work with the land as it's changing? Working more flexibly, alter our view? Here with a climate that's moving, evolving, summers are drier, but winters more wet. Storm, drought and flood, matched with wildfire, erosion, raising the question, how great is our debt? Help us to learn how to live with each species, neighbours to share with our planetary store. Earth has a cycle, a sensitive balance, ours to care fairly, destroy or restore. God, infuse learning, respect for creation. Give us humility, channel your grace. All Earth's resources are precious, yet finite. Help us to value all life in this place. God, help us as we share in these seminars to learn from what we hear, to challenge others to enter into deeper learning, to challenge one another to put into action the things that we perceive as being necessary, that where we live and how we live, environmentally and socially, and in every way, may be a better place, more akin to and in line with your will for your people. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. I'm now trying to get out of sharing. I can't find my screen yet again. Yes, I can. There we are.
Okay. Matt, could we just go to that final screen publicising next week's talk? Okay, so thank you very much, Andrew, for drawing that together. In case it wasn't obvious, that that hymn has been written this evening while we've been listening to Matt's talk and while you were talking in groups, and I'll be circulating it to everybody who's on the email distribution list as a ticket holder tomorrow, so you can reflect on it more fully and at your leisure. Next week's talk is going to be from a scientist called Chris Walsh, who's a PhD student at the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change at the University of Manchester. He's been doing some work with farmers in Malawi, looking at use of bioenergies and trying to get sustainable ways of generating energy, particularly in those communities. Mike was talking about climate change, nature and us, and Chris is going to talk about climate change and others, because I think one of the things we have to be most aware of in this present situation is that we may be feeling the effects of climate change, but there are others across the global south who are really suffering at the moment. And Chris is going to talk a little bit about his experiences of working with communities like that in Malawi, and also some of the solutions that he's been involved in coming up with as a scientist who's getting more involved in policy change in those countries. So I hope you'll join us next Tuesday at 7:30. I don't think I'm going to call for a round of applause because I don't think it's going to work, but on behalf of us all, I'd like to say a real thank you to Mike for joining us and spending us time with this evening, and I look forward to seeing the rest of you next Tuesday evening at 7:30. So see you then. Goodbye.